The air in the traditional tea house didn't just still, it curdled. Minsak, the undisputed Shadow King of Seoul, had just prepared to destroy a young server over a minor slip in etiquette. He thought she was a bug to be crushed. He thought she was a nameless girl in a pink dress, terrified and small. He was wrong. Instead of a plea for mercy, Nari didn't just apologize. She performed a deep, silent royal court bow, a gesture of high-born respect lost to time. Then, she whispered 10 words in a forbidden court dialect that froze the blood of every man in the room. The dragonhead's hand stopped inches from his blade. In that heartbeat, Minsak realized he wasn't looking at a waitress. He was looking at a daughter of the Iron Architects, a ghost from a past he had tried to burn, and the only person who knew his own men were currently planting bombs in his skyscraper. The interior of Mugunghwa Tea House, Seoul's most exclusive sanctuary for the powerful, smelled of high-grade matcha, ancient cedarwood, and pure, suffocating dread. "Move. If there is a single water spot on these Celadon cups, I will personally see to it that you never work in this province again." Manager Kim was a man on the verge of a total collapse. He wiped a sheen of anxiety from his forehead with a silk cloth, his eyes darting between the antique clock and the sliding oak entrance. It was 8:59 p.m. They had 5 minutes. Nari adjusted her silk sash, keeping her head down. She hated nights like this. At 22, she had perfected the art of being a shadow. She wore her hair in a tight, modest braid and avoided all makeup, creating a physical barrier between her hazel eyes and the prying, predatory stares of the elite power holders who frequented the place. "Nari," Kim hissed, snapping his fingers in her face. She flinched, gripping her serving tray tighter. "You are on tea duty. Sparkling, still, and the 50-year-old oolong, nothing else. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look them in the eye. Do not even breathe too loudly. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Nari whispered. "But who is coming?" Kim looked at her as if she'd asked what color the sun was. "The Dragonhead Alliance, Nari, Chairman Minsak himself. If you spill a single drop of water, I will hand you to his enforcers myself." A cold shiver traced its way down Nari's spine. Minsak. Even in the shelter of the kitchen, she knew the name. Everyone in Seoul knew the name, though few dared to whisper it. They owned the construction firms, the shipping docks, and half the politicians in the Blue House. But that was just the surface. Underneath, they were the iron fist of the Korean underworld. "I understand," she whispered. She turned back to the polishing station, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up a porcelain cup. She wasn't trembling from fear of the Mafia, though she was. She was trembling because the name Minsak triggered memories she had spent 10 years trying to bury. Memories of a high-security vault, the smell of burning blueprints, and a life that had been stolen from her in a single night of fire and blood. "Just keep your head down," she told herself. "You're just Nari, the tea girl. You're nobody." Outside, the heavy doors of the tea house groaned open. The air in the room seemed to be sucked out into the hallway. Silence fell over the staff. Even the boiling kettles seemed to quiet down. Manager Kim burst back into the room, his face deathly pale. "They're here! Line up! Everyone, line up!" The entourage didn't walk, they prowled. 6 men in total entered the room. 5 of them were clearly executioners, hulking walls of muscle squeezed into black suits. But it was the man in the center who stopped Nari's heart, Minsak. He moved with a terrifying, rigid authority, his clenched fists and intense stare suggesting a man accustomed to absolute control. And tonight, that control was being challenged. The scent of rain and smoke always seemed to follow the men who broke worlds. In the quiet sanctuary of the Mugunghwa Tea House, that metallic, heavy aroma began to seep through the cedar-planked walls long before the front doors actually opened.
Nari stood by the heavy stone counter, her fingers methodically smoothing the silk of her pale pink hanbok. She focused on the rhythmic friction of the fabric against her palms, a grounding exercise her father had taught her a lifetime ago to keep her heartbeat from betraying her. Outside, the heavy autumn rain of Seoul lashed against the traditional tiled roof, a frantic drumming that masked the sound of the black sedans pulling into the courtyard. Nari didn't need to see them that she knew they were there. She felt the shift in the air, the sudden pressurized silence that descended upon the kitchen staff. Manager Kim, usually a man of endless bustling noise, had gone completely still, his face draining of color until he looked like one of the porcelain dolls on the display shelves. "They're early," Kim whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. He fumbled with a silk handkerchief, swiping at the sweat that had already beaded on his upper lip, despite the chill. "Nari, the oolong, the 50-year-old vintage from the high mountains. If it is steeped 1 second too long, we are all dead men. Do you understand?" Nari didn't look up. She kept her gaze fixed on the steam rising from the cast-iron kettle. "I understand, Manager Kim," she whispered. She moved with the practiced, invisible grace of a ghost. At 22, she had become an expert at being part of the furniture. She was the girl who poured the water, the girl who cleared the dregs, the girl whose name was forgotten the moment she left the room. It was the only way to stay safe when your father was the man who built the vaults that held the secrets of the most dangerous men in Asia. She had spent 10 years burying the Han Nari, who knew how to read a room for exits and structural weaknesses, replacing her with a servant who knew only the temperature of water and the proper angle of a bow.
The heavy oak sliding doors groaned open. The sound was like a thunderclap in the small, intimate space. The warmth of the tea house, meticulously maintained by the charcoal braziers, seemed to be sucked out into the hallway in an instant. A cold, damp wind swept in, smelling of wet pavement and expensive cologne. Then came the boots. It wasn't the sound of casual patrons. It was a disciplined, synchronized march. 5 men in black suits entered first, fanning out into the room with a lethal symmetry that made Nari's skin crawl. They didn't look at the decor or the menu. They looked at corners. They looked at the windows. They looked at Nari's hands to see if she was holding a tray or a weapon. These were the men in black, the Dragonhead's silent executioners, and their presence turned the peaceful tea house into a private fortress. Nari gripped the handle of the kettle, her knuckles whitening. She could feel the weight of their stares, though she never raised her eyes. She focused on the steam, on the hiss of the water, on the way her pink sleeve fluttered in the draft. "Lower your heads," Manager Kim hissed at the staff, his voice barely a tremor. They all bowed, a row of servants folding themselves into the shadows. Nari followed suit, dropping her gaze to the floorboards. From this angle, all she could see were the polished, obsidian-black shoes of the men moving past her. They didn't stop, they prowled. Then came a 6th pair of shoes. These were different. Handmade Italian leather, moving with a heavy, deliberate pace that felt like the ticking of a countdown clock. This was Min Suk. Even from her bowed position, Nari could feel the sheer force of his presence. It was a physical weight, a gravity that pulled at the air in the room. He didn't speak, but the silence he brought with him was more terrifying than any shout. It was the silence of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard, a man who lived in a world where a single nod of his head decided who lived and who burned. As he walked past her toward the VIP alcove, the scent of rain and smoke intensified, mixing with the delicate aroma of the lilies on the counter. Nari felt a sudden sharp ache in her chest, a memory of her father's office, of a man with that same heavy tread coming to take everything away. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fleeting second,
forcing the ghost of the past back into its grave. "You are nobody," she told herself, the mantra echoing in her mind. "You are just a girl in a pink dress. You are just the steam. You are just the tea." But as Min-suk stopped just feet away, his rigid posture casting a long, dark shadow over her folded form, Nari knew the quiet life she had fought so hard to build was over. The lion was in the room, and he was hungry. The VIP alcove was a space of absolute silence, yet the air within it vibrated with a tension that felt like a physical weight. Min-suk did not sit so much as he occupied the room, his presence expanding to fill every corner of the cedar-walled sanctuary. He shed his dark overcoat, handing it to the lead bodyguard without a word or a glance, his movements economical and sharp. Beneath the coat, his suit was a masterpiece of funeral black, emphasizing the rigid military set of his shoulders. He was a man composed entirely of hard lines and suppressed force, his jaw set in a permanent clench that spoke of a rage kept under a razor-thin layer of discipline. As Nari approached with the tea tray, she felt the heat of his authority. It was a strange, suffocating heat, like being too close to a furnace that was bolted shut. Her hands, usually so steady, felt like leaden weights. She kept her chin tucked, her gaze strictly limited to the dark leather of his shoes and the way the silk of her own skirt brushed against the tatami mats. The 5 men in black suits stood like obsidian statues at the perimeter, their eyes moving in a synchronized sweep of the room, but their focus always returned to the man in the center. They weren't just protectors, they were extensions of his will, waiting for the slightest twitch of his fingers to act.
"The 50-year-old oolong, Chairman," Manager Kim's voice squeaked from the threshold. He didn't dare enter the alcove, hovering just outside the boundary of Min-suk's personal space. Min-suk didn't acknowledge the manager. He didn't acknowledge the room. His stare was fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, his eyes dark and unreadable, like deep wells of ink. He leaned forward slightly, his large hands resting on the low table. His fists were closed, the knuckles white, as if he were physically holding himself back from lashing out at the invisible ghosts of a deal gone wrong. This was the restrained dragon, a man who expected the world to bend to his rhythm without him having to utter a single command. Nari knelt beside the table, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The scent of the rain-dampened wool of his suit was overwhelming, mixing with the sharp, clean fragrance of the tea. She began the ceremony, her movements slowed by the sheer pressure of his proximity. She felt his eyes shift. They didn't land on the tea service. They landed on her. It wasn't a look of interest, but a cold, analytical scan, the way a predator looks at a path it's walked 1,000 times, searching for the one pebble that wasn't there yesterday. "Poor," he said. The single word was a low vibration, a sound that seemed to come from his chest rather than his throat. It wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum. Nari lifted the porcelain pot, her fingers brushing the heated clay. The steam rose in a delicate veil between them, and for a fleeting second, she caught a glimpse of his face through the mist. He looked exhausted, but it was the exhaustion of a man who refused to sleep until he had seen his enemies bled dry. There was a scar, faint and jagged, running just below his ear, a mark of a past violence that had never quite healed. As the amber liquid hit the bottom of the cup, the sound was unnervingly loud in the vacuum of the alcove. Nari could feel the eyes of the bodyguards on her neck, watching for a tremor, a spill, a sign of disrespect. Min-suk's gaze remained heavy on her bowed head, his silence more demanding than any interrogation. He was a man who lived in the gaps between words, who judged a person by the way they handled silence. Nari set the cup down with a soft, muffled click. She didn't retreat. She stayed in her bow, her hands clasped tightly to her chest over the soft pink silk. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the restrained energy of a man who was used to obedience so absolute it was silent. He picked up the cup, his movements slow and deliberate, but the tension in his rigid posture never wavered.
He didn't drink immediately. He just held the porcelain, the steam curling around his intense, dark stare. The air was thick with the unspoken, a private reckoning that felt like it had been building for centuries. Nari held her breath, realizing that in this world, even a cup of tea was a battlefield. The amber liquid trembled in the porcelain cup as Minsak raised it to his lips. The silence in the alcove was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy rain outside. But the peace was a lie. Just beyond the cedar partition, the rest of the tea house was a minefield of held breaths. It happened in a heartbeat, a sound so small it should have been insignificant, yet in the presence of the dragon head, it sounded like a gunshot. A soft, wet thud, followed by the unmistakable sharp crack of porcelain hitting the floor. In the main tea room, a younger server, barely 20 and new to the service, had tripped. A single cup had fallen from her tray, shattering into a dozen jagged white shards. The girl went ashen, her eyes wide with a terror so pure it seemed to drain the very life from her face. She didn't move to clean it. She simply froze, staring at the mess as if it were her own spilled blood.
The reaction from Minsak's men was instantaneous. The 5 obsidian statues in the background shifted, their hands moving in a synchronized blur toward the inner linings of their coats. The lead bodyguard, a man with a face like carved granite, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the trembling girl. He didn't need a command. He lived to eliminate any disruption, any noise in the chairman's world. Inside the alcove, Minsak didn't even turn his head. He merely paused with the teacup halfway to his mouth, his jaw tightening until a muscle leaped in his cheek. The suppressed rage that had been simmering beneath his skin flared, turning the air around him scorching. To him, the broken cup wasn't an accident. It was a failure of discipline, an insult to the order he demanded. He set his cup back on the table with a controlled, terrifying deliberation. "Manager Kim," Minsak said, his voice a low, guttural rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. Kim scrambled into the light, his knees hitting the floor before his body could even catch up. "Chairman, please, she is new. She is clumsy. I will deal with her. I will see to it she never—" "You have a leak in your house," Minsak interrupted, his dark eyes finally shifting toward the shattered porcelain visible through the partition. "Clumsiness is a luxury my world does not afford. If she cannot hold a cup, perhaps she does not need the hands that failed her." The bodyguard reached the girl, his large hand gripping her shoulder with a force that made her whimper. He began to drag her toward the back exit, the black door where mistakes went to disappear. The girl's eyes met Nari's for a split second, a silent, desperate scream for help from one nobody to another. Nari felt a cold, familiar fire ignite in her chest. For 10 years, she had been a master of the silence. She had watched her father's world burn and done nothing but run. She had promised herself that staying small was the only way to stay alive. But as she watched the girl's fingers clawing at the floorboards, the Iron Architect's daughter woke up. The dormant sense of justice, the heritage of a family that had once designed the safety of the city, overrode every survival instinct she possessed. She realized, with a clarity that cut through her fear, that she could no longer be just the steam. She could no longer be just the tea. If she stayed silent now, she wasn't surviving. She was dying one piece of her soul at a time. Nari shifted. It wasn't the frantic movement of a servant, but a slow, purposeful realignment of her weight. She didn't look at the bodyguards. She didn't look at the crying girl. She moved until she was directly in Minsak's line of sight, her presence suddenly sharp and undeniable. "Wait," she whispered. The word was small, but in the vacuum of the room, it was a thunderclap. The bodyguard stopped. Manager Kim choked on his own breath. Minsak's head turned with a slow, predatory grace, his intense stare landing on Nari with the force of a physical blow. He looked at her as if she were a ghost that had just manifested out of the floorboards. Nari didn't flinch. She clasped her hands to her chest, the pink silk of her dress crinkling under her grip, and began to descend into a bow that was deeper, slower, and far more ancient than anything the tea house had ever seen. "The tiger does not hunt the rabbit," she began, her voice steadying as the first words of the code left her lips.
when the dragon's own nest is already burning. The room went ice cold. Minsok's hand, which had been reaching for a napkin, froze halfway. The suppressed rage in his eyes was suddenly replaced by something else, a sharp, lethal curiosity. He recognized the rhythm, he recognized the tone, and for the first time in 10 years, Nari didn't care if he recognized her. She only cared that he listened. Nari's forehead touched the cool, polished cedar of the floorboards. It was a royal court bow, a physical articulation of a hierarchy that had officially died with the last dynasty, yet lived on in the shadows of the elite. To the uninitiated, it looked like total surrender. To Minsok, it was a siren blaring in a silent room.
The air in the tea house didn't just still, it seemed to vanish. The lead bodyguard's hand, still clamped like a vice on the young server's shoulder, didn't move an inch. He looked at Nari with a mixture of confusion and lethal intent, waiting for the signal to snap her neck for her insolence. Manager Kim had stopped breathing entirely, his face a ghostly mask of terror. He was certain he was watching the final seconds of a girl he had tried to protect with invisibility. But Nari didn't look up. She remained folded inward, her hands clasped tightly against her chest over the pale pink silk, her voice emerging not as a plea, but as a cool, steady resonance. "The tiger does not hunt the rabbit," she repeated, her voice cutting through the heavy silence like a ceramic blade. "When the dragon's own nest is already burning." Minsok's hand, which had been resting with casual lethality on the table, suddenly gripped the edge of the wood so hard the grain seemed to groan. The restrained dragon didn't explode. He went perfectly, terrifyingly still. The intense dark stare he had used to intimidate the staff shifted, narrowing into two sharp points of obsidian light focused entirely on the back of Nari's head. He knew that phrase. It wasn't a proverb found in books or a line from a drama. It was the third protocol, a specific high-level warning code used by the Iron Architects and the Blue House security detail 50 years ago. It was a signal that an internal betrayal was underway, a code that hadn't been whispered in the underworld since the night the Han family was wiped off the map. "Release her," Minsok said. The command was so low it was almost a vibration, but the bodyguard recoiled as if he'd been struck. He let go of the trembling server, who collapsed into a heap of broken porcelain and tears. "Everyone," Minsok's voice rose only slightly, carrying the edge of a sharpened razor. "Get out, now." The exodus was frantic. Manager Kim practically hauled the sobbing girl toward the kitchen, his eyes darting one last time toward Nari with a look of profound disbelief. The other staff members vanished like shadows at dawn. The 5 men in black suits hesitated, their eyes moving between their chairman and the girl on the floor. "I said everyone," Minsok hissed, his jaw clenching so hard a vein throbbed in his temple. "Release at a perimeter. If I hear a single footstep within 20 paces of this partition, I will have your heads." The bodyguards bowed in unison and retreated, their heavy boots thudding rhythmically until the heavy sliding doors groaned shut. Silence returned, deeper and more suffocating than before. The only sound was the frantic drumming of the rain against the roof and the soft hiss of the charcoal brazier. Nari remained in her bow, her heart hammering against the floorboards, her lungs burning with the effort of staying still. She could feel the weight of Minsok's gaze on her. It was a predatory, analytical heat that felt like it was peeling back the layers of her pink dress to find the Iron Architect's daughter underneath. Slowly, Minsok stood. The movement was fluid and dangerous. He walked around the low table, his handmade Italian leather shoes coming to a stop just inches from Nari's folded hands. The scent of rain and smoke was overpowering now, a dark shroud that seemed to isolate the two of them in a world where time had stopped. "Raise your head," he commanded. It wasn't a shout, but the absolute authority in his voice made Nari's spine straighten of its own accord. She rose slowly, uncurling from her royal bow with a grace she hadn't realized she still possessed.
She didn't look at the floor this time. She didn't hide behind her modest braid or her downcast eyes. She looked him directly in the face, her hazel eyes meeting his dark, intense stare with a courage that was born of having nothing left to lose. Minsak reached down, his large, scarred hand moving toward her throat. Nari didn't flinch. He didn't grab her. Instead, his thumb hooked under the delicate silver chain she wore hidden beneath her collar. He pulled it upward, revealing the small, tarnished crest of a gear and a lotus, the seal of the architect.
You, Minsak whispered, his voice thick with a decade of suppressed rage and a sudden, shocking recognition. You died in the fire. I watched the house fall. The house fell, Chairman, Nari replied, her voice no longer trembling. But the architect built a way out. And right now, the men you brought with you are waiting for the signal to finish what they started 10 years ago. The room went ice cold again, but this time the dragon wasn't looking at the rabbit. He was looking at the woman who was the only thing standing between him and a grave. The silence following the departure of the bodyguards was thick, heavy with the scent of rain-dampened wool and the bitter metallic tang of adrenaline. Minsak stood motionless, his looming shadow stretching across the tatami mats until it touched Nari's knees. He didn't move to strike her, but his stillness was more menacing than any outburst. He was a man who had spent his life deciphering the architecture of lies, and he was currently looking at a woman who had just collapsed his entire reality with 10 words. The architects, Minsak whispered, the name sounding like a curse on his tongue. He stepped closer, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from Nari's face, tracing the air as if trying to see through a mask. The Han family was erased. I personally walked through the embers of that compound. I saw the blueprints turn to ash. There were no survivors. Nari held his gaze, her breath hitching, but her eyes remaining steady. My father didn't just build vaults for your money, Chairman. He built the world you live in. Do you really think he would design a home for his daughter without a shadow path out? Minsak's hand finally made contact, his fingers gripping her chin with a bruising intensity, forcing her to look up at him. His suppressed rage had shifted into a cold, clinical interrogation. The heat radiating from him was suffocating. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his voice a low vibration that made the teacups on the table rattle. "Which family pulled you out of the wreckage and kept you on ice for 10 years? Was it the Kang Syndicate, the Iron Circle?" He leaned in, his face so close Nari could see the flecks of gold in his dark, obsidian eyes. "They sent you here to wait, to play the part of the invisible girl, to wait for the moment I was vulnerable so you could whisper a code and crawl into my head. Tell me, who is paying you to play the ghost?" Nari felt the sting of his grip, but she didn't pull away. She saw the flickers of paranoia dancing in his eyes, the common disease of a man who has reached the top by stepping over corpses. "No one sent me, Minsak," she said, using his name without a title for the first time. The sound of it seemed to startle him, his grip loosening just a fraction. "I've spent 10 years trying to forget the smell of that fire. I wanted to be a nobody. I wanted to pour tea and disappear into the rain." She took a shallow breath, the silk of her pink dress rustling. "But I saw that girl, the server. I saw your man's hand on her, and I realized that you haven't changed. You're still the man who lets his nest burn because he's too busy hunting rabbits." Minsak's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching so hard a vein throbbed in his temple. "You expect me to believe in a coincidence that the daughter of the Iron Architect just happens to be serving me oolong on the very night my empire is being picked apart from the inside?" "It's not a coincidence that I'm here," Nari countered, her voice dropping to a whisper.
I chose this tea house because it was the only place in the city built with the old foundations. It's the only place with a reinforced basement that leads to the city's central artery. I thought I was safe here, but then you walked in, and I saw them, your men in black." She glanced toward the closed sliding doors, where the shadows of his bodyguards were visible through the paper screens. "Look at their formation, Minsak. They aren't standing in a defensive perimeter. They are standing in a containment sweep. They aren't waiting to protect you from an outside threat. They are waiting for the signal to ensure no one leaves this room alive, including you."
Minsak froze. His analytical mind, sharpened by 1,000 betrayals, began to process the layout of the room, the timing of the mistake with the broken cup, and the unusual silence from the street outside. His hand dropped from her chin, his fingers twitching toward the hidden holster beneath his suit jacket. The private reckoning was no longer about who Nari was, but about what she represented, the return of a truth he had tried to bury. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the courage beneath the soft pink silk and the tactical brilliance inherited from a man he had once respected and feared. "If you are lying to me," Minsak murmured, his voice deathly quiet, "I will make the fire from 10 years ago look like a mercy." "If I were lying," Nari replied, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs, "I would have let them take that girl. I would have stayed invisible. But the dragon's nest is burning, Chairman, and I'm the only one who knows where the fire exit is." The ambient hiss of the charcoal brazier was the only sound in the alcove as Minsak processed Nari's words. His hand, still hovering near his jacket, stilled, but the intensity in his eyes didn't soften. He was a man who lived by the blade and died by the lie. To him, every gift was a trap, and every hero was merely a mercenary waiting for a better offer. "The architect's blueprints were perfect," Minsak said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low velvet. "I reviewed them myself when we seized your family's assets. There were no flaws, no blind spots. That is why your father was the best. If you are claiming there is a way to bypass my security, you are either the greatest liar I've ever met, or you are a ghost trying to haunt a man who doesn't believe them." Nari stood her ground, her silhouette framed by the flickering shadows of the paper screens. The pink silk of her dress seemed to glow in the dim light, a stark contrast to the darkness of his suit. "My father was a perfectionist, yes," she replied, her voice gaining a sharp clinical edge. "But he was also a father. He knew that the men he built for, men like you, eventually turn on their architects. He never built a fortress without a breathe hole, a single structural omission designed to let his family out if the walls ever became a cage." She stepped toward the low table, picking up a stray piece of charcoal from the service tray. With a steady hand, she began to sketch on the white paper mat. The Dragon Head Tower, 72 floors of reinforced steel and biometric locks. You think you're safe because you have the master key, but the master key is a digital tether, and tethers can be cut. Minsak watched her hand move, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the cross-section of his own headquarters. The restrained dragon was gone, replaced by a predator realizing he was already in a trap. "The ventilation shafts in the sub-basement don't just circulate air," Nari continued, her strokes precise. "They are aligned with the building's seismic dampeners. If you override the pressure valves from the tea house's secondary junction, the one directly beneath where we are sitting, the biometric locks on your executive floor won't just fail, they will seal. You'll be locked out of your own armory while your lieutenants drain your accounts from the inside." Minsak leaned over the table, his knuckles white as he pressed his weight into the wood. The scent of rain and smoke from his coat seemed to sharpen, filling the space between them. He wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. He was looking at the master key itself. "If you are lying to me," Minsak hissed,
his face inches from hers. "Why tell me this? If you hate me for what happened 10 years ago, why not let the nest burn? Why not let my men finish the job?" Nari looked him directly in his dark obsidian eyes, her own hazel gaze burning with a fierce, quiet integrity. "My father built things not to be destroyed. He built them to endure. And because I know that if the dragon head falls tonight, the men who replace you will turn this city into a graveyard. I'm not a spy, Minsak. I'm a Han. We don't burn the world down. We fix the foundations."
Minsak's breath hitched, a rare crack in his iron composure. He saw the truth in her defiance, a pride that matched his own, a legacy that refused to be extinguished. For a decade, he had thought he had destroyed the architects, but as he looked at Nari, he realized he had merely forced the most dangerous one into the shadows. "If you are wrong about the junction," Minsak murmured, his hand finally moving away from his holster and coming to rest on the sketch, "we both die in this tea house before the rain stops." "I'm not wrong," Nari said, her voice a calm anchor in the rising storm. "But you need to move now. The men outside aren't waiting for your orders anymore. They're waiting for the clock." As if on cue, the muffled sound of a distant vibration rolled through the floorboards. Not thunder, but the heavy rhythmic pulse of a building's systems being diverted. The flaw had been activated, and the fortress was turning against its king. Minsak's gaze snapped from the drawing to Nari's face, a silent understanding passing between them. The private reckoning was over. The war for the city had begun. The vibration that had started as a low rhythmic pulse suddenly intensified, transforming into a violent shudder that groaned through the very foundation of the Mugunghua tea house. For a second, the only sound was the rattling of the antique Celadon cups against the stone counter, a frantic chattering noise that felt like a warning. Then, a muffled boom echoed from the distance, a heavy enough sound to shake the rain from the roof and rattle the heavy oak doors in their tracks. It wasn't thunder, it was the sound of the city's heart being torn open. Minsak's head snapped toward the window, his jaw tightening so hard the bone seemed ready to snap. He didn't need to see the smoke rising over the skyline to know what had happened. The Dragon Head Tower, his crown jewel, had just been breached. "The secondary junction," Nari said, her voice barely audible over the fading echo of the blast. Her face remained a mask of focused calm, but her hands were clenched so tightly in the pink silk of her dress that her knuckles were white. "They didn't wait for the pressure to build. They're forcing the override manually." Minsak didn't reply. He moved with the fluid, lethal speed of a predator who had finally seen the trap. He reached for the encrypted radio at his belt, his thumb hovering over the emergency channel. "Team Alpha, status report. Secure the perimeter and bring the car to the primary extraction point. Now." The radio hissed with a terrifying hollow static. No voice returned the call, no confirmation of the order. Only the sound of the rain lashing against the paper screens and the distant rising wail of sirens. "Team Alpha?" Minsak's voice was a low, guttural rasp, his suppressed rage finally beginning to crack the surface. He tried the secondary channel, then the third. Silence. Every frequency was dead, jammed by a high-intensity signal that could only have been activated from within his own security detail. A shadow shifted against the paper screen of the sliding door. It wasn't the erratic movement of a panicked servant, but the slow, deliberate silhouette of a man leveling a weapon. "Minsak, get down!" Nari's voice rang out, no longer the whisper of a tea girl, but the command of an architect who knew exactly where the shadows were darkest. She didn't wait for him to move. She lunged forward, her small frame colliding with his rigid chest, her momentum forcing him away from the center of the alcove, just as the paper screen shredded under a burst of suppressed gunfire. Splinters of wood and fragments of paper exploded into the room, dancing in the dim light of the braziers.
Minsak hit the floor with a grunt, pulling Nari down with him, his body acting as a shield of hard muscle and expensive wool. He finally drew the blackened steel of his handgun, his eyes fixed on the door with a cold, terrifying clarity. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was a man who had been betrayed by the very people he had hand-picked to be his shadows. The door was kicked open, and the lead bodyguard, the man with the face of carved granite, stepped into the light. He wasn't alone. 3 of the loyal men in black suits stood behind him, their expressions emotionless, their weapons trained on the man they had sworn to die for. "Chairman," the lead bodyguard said, his voice flat and devoid of any remorse, "the nest is burning. It's time to let go of the keys." Minsock let out a low, dark laugh, a sound that carried the edge of a sharpened blade. He didn't look at the guns. He looked at the men he had called brothers. Vinny the Butcher was always a better strategist than he was a soldier. He promised you the city, didn't he? He told you that once the tower fell, the dragon would be easy to slay. "He didn't promise us the city," the bodyguard replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. "He promised us survival, something you can no longer offer." Minsock's grip on his weapon tightened, his knuckles white. He was a man cornered, his empire crumbling in the distance, and his executioner standing 6 feet away. But as he felt Nari's steady breath against his side, he realized the traitors had made one fatal mistake. They thought he was alone. They thought he was just a king without a throne. They hadn't accounted for the girl in the pink dress who knew every secret door in the city. "The junction," Nari hissed into his ear, her voice a sharp, tactical needle through the tension. "The steam vent behind the service wall. If you hit the release, the thermal sensors will flood the room with whiteout. We'll have 10 seconds. Minsock didn't hesitate. He didn't ask how she knew or if she was sure. He trusted the architect's daughter more than he had ever trusted his own blood. With a roar of restrained fury, he fired a single calculated shot, not at the men, but at the brass valve protruding from the cedar wall behind them. The dragon had been cornered, but the fire was only just beginning. The brass valve hissed with a violent, piercing shriek as Minsock's bullet tore through the metal. In an instant, the pressurized steam from the tea house's ancient heating system surged into the alcove, creating a thick, blinding curtain of white vapor. The lead bodyguard roared a command, but his words were drowned out by the roar of the escaping pressure. Gunshots splintered the cedar walls, the muzzles flashing like angry strobe lights in the fog, but the bullets struck only wood and shadow. "Follow my voice," Nari hissed, her hand finding Minsock's arm in the chaos. She didn't grab him with the desperation of a victim. She gripped him with the authority of a guide. She pulled him toward the back of the alcove, toward a heavy decorative screen that featured a carved mountain range. To anyone else, it was a piece of art. To Nari, it was a lever. She reached behind the mahogany frame and depressed a concealed catch. With a groan of heavy stone and shifting gears, a section of the wall receded, revealing a narrow, lightless throat of a corridor that smelled of damp earth and cold minerals. Minsock didn't hesitate. He stepped into the darkness, his weapon still raised, his back to Nari as he scanned the steam behind them. "How deep does this go?" he rasped, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Deep enough to get beneath the street level," Nari replied, sliding the panel shut just as the first of the bodyguards lunged into the alcove. The heavy stone clicked into place, muffling the shouts and the sounds of fists pounding against the wood. "This is a secondary service vein. My father called it the narrow path. It connects the tea house to the old subway drainage system, which leads directly to the foundations of the Dragonhead Tower." They moved in a frantic, hunched pace through the tunnel. The only light came from the dim, greenish glow of Minsock's tactical watch and the occasional spark of his lighter. The walls were lined with rusted pipes and bundles of thick black cables, the nervous system of the city that Nari's father had mapped out decades ago. Minsock's breath was heavy, his rigid posture strained by the low ceiling. Every few steps he paused, tilting his head to listen to the vibrations above. He was a man accustomed to being the hunter, the one who dictated the terms of the engagement. Now he was being led through the dirt by a woman in a pink dress who seemed to know the darkness better than he knew his own boardroom. "They'll be at the main exits," Minsak muttered, his thumb tracing the grip of his handgun. "Vinny isn't a fool. He'll have the block cordoned off. He'll have thermal scanners on the manholes." "He knows your habits, Minsak, not my father's blueprints," Nari countered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. She stopped at a rusted iron ladder that descended into a vertical shaft. "There is a junction 300 meters ahead. It's a dead zone for sensors because of the high voltage transformers for the rail line. We can cross the district entirely underground." She began to climb down, her silk hanbok rustling against the cold iron. Minsak followed, his large hands gripping the rungs with a white-knuckled intensity. As they reached the bottom, the tunnel opened into a wider gallery where water dripped from the ceiling into a dark, sluggish stream. Minsak caught up to her, his hand reaching out to steady her as she stumbled over a loose brick. His touch was no longer the bruising grip of an interrogator. It was the reflexive protection of a man who realized his life was entirely in her hands. He looked at her, the dim light catching the sharp lines of his face and the raw, suppressed rage in his eyes. "Why?" he asked, the question hanging in the damp air. "You could have left me in that room. You could have let them kill me and walked away into the rain. Why save the man who broke your world?" Nari paused, her back to him as she looked at a faded marking on the wall, a small etched gear, her father's signature. She turned to face him, her hazel eyes reflecting the faint light with a quiet, devastating honesty. "Because if I let you die, then the fire wins," she said softly. "My father built things to last, Minsak. He built me to survive. If I let the city fall to men like Vinny, then everything the Han family stood for is truly dead. I'm not saving a Mafia boss. I'm protecting the only man who can keep the foundations from crumbling." Minsak stared at her, the restrained dragon finally seeing a power that didn't come from a gun or a bank account. He gave a single curt nod, the silence between them no longer a battlefield, but a pact. "Lead the way, architect," he murmured. They moved deeper into the narrow path, two ghosts of a forgotten soul, moving toward a fortress that was no longer a home, but a target. Above them, the city bled rain. Below them, the war for the future was just beginning. The transition from the damp, claustrophobic darkness of the tunnels to the sterile, hyper-modern expanse of the Dragonhead HQ was like stepping through a tear in reality. They emerged through a concealed panel in the maintenance sublevel, a space of humming servers and glowing blue conduits. Above them, the fortress of glass loomed, 72 stories of steel and ego that were now vibrating with the frantic energy of a dying empire. The air here didn't smell of rain or tea. It smelled of ozone, burnt circuitry, and the cold, metallic scent of a coup in its final stages. "The executive lift is dead," Nari whispered, her eyes scanning the digital floor status displays. Her pink hanbok was stained of the soot of the tunnels, a fragile splash of color against the monochromatic gray of the server room. "They've locked the primary shafts. We have to use the pressurized fire stairs in the western quadrant. It's the only path the biometric override can't reach yet."
Minsak didn't hesitate, though his face was a mask of granite. He moved with a predatory grace, his handgun held low, his eyes never stopping their restless, lethal sweep of the hallways. He was no longer just the restrained dragon. He was a king returning to a burning throne, and the rage that had been simmering beneath his suit was now a cold, focused fire. They reached the lobby of the 60th floor, a vast open space of floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the rain-slicked neon of Seoul. The city looked like a circuit board far below, indifferent to the violence erupting in its highest towers. but as the heavy fire doors hissed shut behind them, the sound of a slow, rhythmic clapping echoed through the glass chamber. "I have to hand it to you, Chairman," a voice drawled, dripping with a mock respect that made Minsok's jaw tighten. "Coming back through the drainage pipes, it's poetic, a rat returning to the sewer." Standing by the panoramic window was Kang, Minsok's second in command, a man who had stood at Minsok's right hand for 15 years. He wasn't alone. 6 tactical operators in full gear were fanned out in a semicircle, their laser sights cutting through the dim light like red needles. Minsok stepped in front of Nari, his broad shoulders shielding her from the line of fire. It was a reflexive, protective movement that seemed to surprise Kang. "Kang," Minsok said, his voice a low, guttural vibration. "I taught you how to hunt. I didn't think I'd have to teach you how to die." Kang laughed, but his eyes stayed fixed on the girl behind Minsok. "You didn't teach me everything, Chairman. You forgot to mention you were hiding the last Han. Vinny was right. You've gone soft. You're protecting a ghost in a pink dress while your accounts are being bled dry." "She's not a ghost, Kang," Minsok replied, his voice dropping to a deathly quiet. "She's the architect of your ending." "Kill him," Kang commanded, his voice losing his playfulness. "But leave the girl. Vinny wants the codes in her head before we bury her." The room exploded. Minsok didn't wait for the first trigger pull. He lunged backward, his hand catching Nari's waist and pulling her behind a structural marble pillar, just as a hail of bullets shattered the glass behind them. The fortress of glass began to rain shards of crystal, the wind of the storm outside howling into the executive floor. Minsok returned fire with a precision that bordered on the supernatural, his movements fluid despite the cramped cover. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore, he was fighting for the only person who had looked him in the eye and told him the truth. "The terminal!" Nari shouted, over the roar of the wind and gunfire, pointing towards a grass-encased console near the center of the room. "If I can get to that hub, I can seal the floor and trap them in the elevator lobby, but I need 10 seconds. Minsok looked at the open space between the pillar and the console, a 20-foot kill zone illuminated by the red dots of the snipers. He looked back at Nari, seeing the fierce, quiet brilliance in her hazel eyes. The man who expected immediate obedience finally gave it.
"Go!" Minsok rasped, stepping out from behind the marble. He stood tall, his silhouette a dark, defiant target against the Seoul skyline. He began to fire, a relentless, punishing rhythm that forced the tactical team to dive for cover. "I'll hold the line! Go!" As Nari sprinted across the glass-strewn floor, Minsok stood his ground, the dragon protecting the architect in the heart of the storm. For the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for a legacy that was worth saving. The terminal sat like a glowing island in the center of the shattered glass floor. Nari lunged for it, her knees skidding across the debris, the pale pink silk of her hanbok tearing against the sharp edges of what used to be a billion-dollar view. Behind her, the air was a symphony of violence. Minsok stood as a monolithic silhouette against the jagged Seoul skyline, his weapon barking in a steady, rhythmic cadence that forced Kang's tactical team to flatten themselves against the far walls. He was a wall of muscle and fire, drawing every red laser sight onto his own chest so she could have her 10 seconds. Nari's fingers flew across the glass interface. She wasn't looking for a password, she was looking for the pulse. Her father had taught her that every building had a nervous system, and every nervous system had a gag reflex. She bypassed the primary security layers, her mind racing through the old blueprints. "Come on," she hissed, her breath hitching as a bullet ricocheted off the console's base, showering her in sparks. 5 seconds, Nari, Minsok roared, his voice straining. He slammed a fresh magazine into his handgun, his breathing heavy, his suit jacket shredded at the shoulder. He was running out of floor, and Kang was beginning to realize the dragon was pinned. Kang sensed the shift. He stepped out from the safety of a reinforced pillar, his face twisted in a sneer of triumph. "Enough of this. Kill them both."
As the tactical team rose to finish the execution, Nari didn't finish the code. Instead, she reached into the service panel beneath the console, a trick her father had shown her when she was 6 to make the lights dance. She ripped a handful of fiber optic cables and jammed them into the high-voltage cooling port. The effect was instantaneous and blinding. The building's localized fire suppression system misinterpreted the massive electrical surge as a flash fire. A series of high-intensity magnesium flares designed to illuminate smoke-filled hallways detonated in a synchronized burst across the ceiling. The room turned a violent, sterile white, blinding anyone wearing tactical night vision or focused optics. In that heartbeat of whiteout, Nari didn't hide, she moved. Minsak, squinting against the glare, expected her to stay down. Instead, he saw a flash of pink silk moving through the haze with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a T-girl. Nari didn't run away from the danger, she ran toward it. She used the disorientation of the flash to close the gap between the console and Kang. She didn't use a gun. She used the weight of a heavy glass T-weight she had snatched from the console, swinging it in a precise tactical arc. It caught the first operator in the temple, dropping him instantly. Before the second man could blink, she had bridged the distance, her small hand catching his wrist and twisting with a sickening pop, using his own momentum to drive him to the floor.
Minsak watched, paralyzed for a split second by the sheer lethality of her movement. This wasn't the shy waitress or the invisible girl. This was Han, trained in the brutal, silent arts of shadow defense that the architects used to protect their secrets. Nari reached Kang just as he rubbed the grit from his eyes. He raised his weapon, but she was already under his guard. She didn't hesitate. She drove her palm into his chin, snapping his head back, and followed with a sweep that took his legs out from under him. As he hit the glass, she didn't show mercy. She pressed the muzzle of his own dropped weapon against his throat, her eyes no longer hazel and soft, but cold and sharp as the shards surrounding them. "The mask is off, Kang," she whispered, her voice a low, lethal vibration that cut through the howling wind. Minsak stepped forward, his boots crunching on the glass, his gun still raised, but his gaze fixed entirely on Nari. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a daughter of a ghost or a tool to be used, but as a predator who had been hiding in plain sight. The restrained dragon felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in decades, a profound, terrifying respect. Nari stood up, letting the traitor gasp for air at her feet. She wiped a smear of blood from her cheek and looked at Minsak. The pink dress was ruined, her hair was coming loose from its braid, and she was covered in the dust of his falling empire. But as she stood there, the weapon steady in her hand, she had never looked more like royalty. "The floor is sealed," she said, her voice returning to that calm architectural steady. "But Vinny is already at the vault. If we want to save the city, we have to stop playing with the rabbits and go for the heart." The descent toward the sub-basement vaults was a journey through the cooling embers of an empire. The elevator was a mangled cage of steel, so they took the service stairs, their footsteps echoing like heartbeats against the concrete. Minsak led the way, his movements heavy with a newfound weariness, yet his grip on his weapon never faltered. Behind him, Nari moved with the quiet focus of a master builder returning to her blueprints. The pink silk of her dress was stained of oil and gunpowder, a tattered banner of the girl she used to be. They stopped at the final bulkhead, a 10-ton slab of reinforced titanium that guarded the city's digital ledger. The air here was frigid, chilled by the massive cooling units required to keep the servers from melting down. Minsak leaned against the cold metal, his breath hitching in his chest. He looked at the blood on his knuckles, then at the girl who had spent her life hiding from men exactly like him. "Vinny is gone," Minsak rasped, his voice sounding like dry earth. "The scanners show his signature left the building through the helipad 3 minutes ago. He didn't want the throne, he just wanted to burn the kingdom and walk away with the ashes." Nari stepped toward the control terminal, her eyes scanning the lines of code scrolling across the screen. He triggered a thermal purge. In 5 minutes, the servers will hit critical temperature and wipe every account, every deed, and every debt in the city. He's not just stealing your money, Minsock. He's erasing the foundations of Seoul. Minsock looked at her, the restrained dragon finally stripped of his armor. He saw the way her fingers danced across the interface, the legacy of the Iron Architect flowing through her veins. He realized then that his entire life had been a series of transactions, loyalties bought with fear, debts settled with blood, and in the end, the men he had paid the most had been the first to sharpen their knives. The only person who had stood by him, the only one who had bled for him, was the woman whose life he had destroyed 10 years ago.
Why? Minsock asked, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself since he was a child. I stood on that terrace and watched your home burn. I took your name, I took your family. Why are you still here, Nadi? Nadi paused, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her hazel eyes. She didn't look at him with hatred, nor with forgiveness. She looked at him with a profound, terrifying clarity. Because the world doesn't need another ghost, Minsock. It needs someone to hold the line. My father built this city to be a fortress, not a graveyard. If I let it burn, then I'm just like you. Minsock walked over to her, his shadow falling over the terminal. He didn't reach for the controls. Instead, he reached for her hand, the hand that had poured his tea, that had performed the royal bow, and that had just disarmed his deadliest assassin. He took her palm in his large, scarred fingers closing around hers in a grip that wasn't a command, but a covenant. I have spent my life making people small, Minsock whispered, his dark eyes locking onto hers. I thought power was the ability to make a city bow. I was wrong. True power is the person who stands up when the world is falling. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, the scent of rain and smoke finally softening into something human. Listen to me, Nadi Han. From this moment on, the Dragonhead Alliance belongs to the architects. I will rebuild what I broke. And I swear on the blood of my fathers, no one, not a king, not a traitor, and certainly not me, will ever make you bow again. Nadi felt the weight of his vow settle into her bones. It wasn't a romantic promise, it was a blood covenant between two survivors who had found the only truth left in a city of lies. She didn't pull away. For the first time in 10 years, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like the foundation. Don't make promises you can't keep, Chairman, she murmured, though a small ghost of a smile touched her lips. I don't make promises, Minsock replied, his hand tightening around hers as the alarm on the terminal began to wail. I build legacies. Now, architect, save my city. The digital purge was stopped not with a hammer, but with a whisper. As the vault's cooling fans roared like dying beasts, Nadi's fingers danced across the primary terminal, entering the final sequence of her father's failsafe. With a definitive chime that echoed through the titanium chamber, the thermal spike flatlined. The accounts were frozen, the deeds were locked, and the Iron Architect's city was saved from a digital ghost. The weeks that followed the Night of Ash were not quiet, but they were different. The Dragonhead Alliance underwent a transformation that Seoul's underworld had never seen. The restrained dragon had returned to his throne, but he no longer sat alone. The purge of the traitors had been surgical and absolute, led by a man who now moved with a purpose beyond simple survival. On the 72nd floor of the newly fortified Dragonhead Tower, the scent of rain and smoke had been replaced by the clean, sharp aroma of high mountain oolong. The panoramic glass had been replaced with reinforced crystal, looking out over a city that was slowly being rebuilt from its foundations.
The heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite swung open, and for a moment the room went still. There was no girl in a soft pink dress. There was no invisible servant with downcast eyes and a trembling tray. Nari walked into the room with the measured, lethal grace of a woman who had designed the very ground she walked on. She wore a suit of midnight charcoal, sharp, structured, and commanding, with a silk blouse the color of a winter sky. Her hair, once pulled into a severe, modest braid, now fell in dark, polished waves over her shoulders. Around her neck, the silver crest of the architects was no longer tucked beneath a collar. It hung openly, a badge of a lineage that had returned from the dead. Minsak stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn immediately, but the tension in his shoulders, the suppressed rage that had defined him for 20 years, seemed to have transformed into something more like granite. When he finally turned, his dark obsidian eyes didn't look for a subordinate, they looked for a peer. "The Kang Syndicate's holdings in the harbor have been liquidated," Nari said, her voice a cool, architectural steady as she placed a tablet on the desk. "I've diverted the assets into a trust for the families displaced by Vinny's fires. The foundations are stable, Minsak. The city is breathing again." Minsak walked toward her, his heavy tread no longer a threat, but a rhythm she knew as well as her own. He stopped just inches away, the air between them crackling with the memory of the blood covenant they had made in the dark. He looked at the woman before him, the invisible daughter who had become the brain to his muscle, the strategist to his dragon. "I had a report from the tea house this morning," Minsak murmured, a rare, genuine spark of amusement in his intense stare. "Manager Kim is still looking for a new head server. He says the flowers don't smell the same without you." Nari offered a small, dangerous smile. "Manager Kim will have to learn that some flowers have thorns that go too deep to be kept in a vase." Minsak reached out, his large, scarred hand coming to rest on the small of her back, not to lead her, but to stand with her. He looked out at the sprawling neon grid of Seoul, a city that finally had a master who understood that a fortress is only as strong as the person who knows its flaws. "They are calling you the queen of the underground in the back rooms of Gangnam," Minsak said, his voice dropping to a low vibration. "The men who used to ignore you are now terrified to even whisper your name." "Let them be terrified," Nari replied, looking out at the skyline her father had helped build. "It's easier to design a world when the rabbits stay in their holes." The dragon and the architect stood together at the edge of the world, a collision of power and brilliance that had emerged from the fire. Nari was no longer the girl who bowed to the boss. She was the one who told the boss where the shadows were. The invisible daughter was gone, and in her place stood the woman who held the keys to the kingdom. The dragon's nest was no longer burning. It was being rebuilt, stone by stone, by the only person the dragon ever trusted.